Justin Timberlake gets arrested for a DUI. So what happens next? Let's talk about it. My name is Jamahl Kersey, and I'm the principal attorney at Kersey Law. We're a boutique criminal defense firm in San Diego, California. And listen, every night in every city in the United States, someone gets arrested for a DUI. So, just generally speaking, there's nothing really special about a DUI. They're not newsworthy offenses unless there's a fatality. So if you have a drunk driver who plows through a red light and ends up killing somebody, then oftentimes that'll make the nightly news just because there's, heightened interest, obviously, in someone losing their life. And, shout out to all the families of people who lost their life. My heart definitely goes out to you. There's never a situation where you have a DUI with a fatality that's not a sad situation. But anyhow, thank God that didn't happen here. Really, again, these are not newsworthy situations, but when it is the man who brought sexy back, we're talking about the guy who told his ex to cry him a river, then a DUI arrest is newsworthy, right? This is the former Mouseketeer, the former NSYNC member, Justin Timberlake. He's facing criminal charges for driving under the influence of alcohol. And that's the thing about DUIs. I mean, they don't discriminate. You can have construction workers, lawyers, doctors, garbage men, and famous singers getting arrested for a DUI. And, it's just one of those offenses where people don't truly feel like they're a criminal, right? So compared to if you commit a burglary or you're selling drugs, those are the types of offenses where people label somebody as a criminal, but DUIs aren't, the case with that. I'm curious, what are your thoughts? If Justin Timberlake ends up getting convicted of a DUI, are you judging him, or it really doesn't move the needle on how you feel about his character, right? As for me, I just don't really judge folks for almost anything, right? Certainly not committing crimes. I just don't feel like it's my place. My role as a criminal defense attorney for my clients, and I've represented people charged and accused of some very serious things, including homicide and sexual assaults and all these different type of things. But my role is to protect their rights, protect the constitutional rights, make sure they get treated fairly within the system. It's not my job to judge, and I don't do that. But as for my thoughts on Justin Timberlake, listen, if he ends up getting convicted and My Love, Sexy Back ends up coming on in the club, I'm still gonna groove. I'm still gonna get my two-step on. But anyhow, Justin Timberlake was driving just after midnight when an officer pulled him over, and he had apparently failed to stop at a stop sign and failed to stay in his lane of travel. And listen, the majority of DUIs actually happen late at night, and this makes sense. This is when people are leaving house parties, when they're leaving the bar, when they're leaving the club, right? And so officers are going to be patrolling the streets, and they're looking at the busy areas, nightclubs and restaurants and bars and hotels, and they're going to be looking around for people driving under the influence of alcohol. You may not know it, but there are over 100 cues that an officer can look at in order to see if somebody might be driving under the influence of alcohol. And, like the officer noted in this particular case, failing to stop at a stop sign is one of those cues, and so is swerving within a lane. Obviously, if you're driving on the road, you got to keep your car in one lane. Other ones can be, driving with no lights on. You got to make sure you turn your lights on the car. You could be speeding. You could be driving way too slow. So we've all seen, somebody driving super slow on a freeway or even in the city streets. That's definitely going to be probable cause for an officer to proceed with a traffic stop. Once they make that traffic stop, they're going to be asking for routinely license, registration, insurance. And the officer's going to start making, the little small talk, do you know why I pulled you over? And as they're interacting with you and you're giving answers to their questions, they're making certain observations, right? How's your speech pattern, right? Is your speech slurred? Are you speaking super fast? Are you speaking super slow? Are you nervous? Are you fidgety? Are your eyes bloodshot or glassy? Those are going to be things that they're going to note in their reports. And the big one that makes it in pretty much every report when we're talking about a DUI is quote unquote, I smelled the strong odor of an alcoholic beverage. That's the one that they always say. I smelled an alcoholic beverage coming from his breath or coming from his person or, emitting from the vehicle, right? And so once they have that, then they're going to, dive further into their investigation to determine whether or not you might be driving under the influence of alcohol. Just because they smell an alcoholic beverage, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to make a DUI arrest. They could, go through their observations and ultimately make the determination that you're not under the influence of alcohol and let you go. But as they're making these observations, they're eventually going to ask if you've had anything to drink tonight, right? And most people who are driving under the influence of alcohol will always lie in response to this question. And the standard answer is, I had 2 or 3 beers. Right. And the reason why people say this is because if they say, well, I only had 1 drink, then that doesn't really make sense, because who goes out and just has 1 drink? Right. So being honest and saying, I had 8 to 10 drinks, that's probably going to get you in trouble. Right. So if you admit, hey, I had 3 beers, I had a martini, I had a Jack and Coke, I had a couple rum and Cokes, right? That sounds like a horrible hangover and just a bad stomach ache the next day. But if you're being honest about your actual list of drinks that you had, then people, just think, hey, I'm going to get in trouble, so I'm going to say I only had 2 or 3 beers. The best thing would be not to drink and drive at all, right? I mean, it's 2024. Listen, there are Ubers, there are cabs. Call your mom, call your best friend. Just don't drive after you've been drinking. I mean, it's really simple at this point. But listen, if you're already in that situation and you get pulled over and, you're being investigated for a DUI, you might as well, you still have the right to not incriminate yourself, so you don't have to answer the questions. And if you don't answer the questions, then at least you're not building up a case against yourself, because all these questions that you're answering, you're giving the officer more and more information that's going to support the probable cause to ultimately arrest you. So according to the court records, Justin Timberlake had told the police that he had 1 martini. So just 1 martini, and he was following his friends home. And so the officer ordered him to do field sobriety tests. So he's making these observations. He noted that Justin had slowed speech. He was unsteady afoot. So, and also he was performing pretty poorly on the standard field sobriety tests. So again, if you're not able to maintain your balance, that is an indication that you might be impaired. Definitely, if you're not performing well on the field sobriety tests, that might also mean that you're impaired. And so a lot of times when we're doing our initial consultations, people, remember, whether it's the day before or the night before or days later, they'll say, hey, I felt like I passed the test. But what you have to understand is these are not pass or fail tests, right? The officer is just making observations as you're doing these tests. And you probably heard, the pin test, where they're asking you to follow a pin or an object with just your eyes. You might have the walk and turn test, where they're asking you to take a number of steps and then turn around and then walk backwards. Sometimes they'll have you count backwards from 100 to some random number like 53, right? Sometimes they'll ask you to do, say the ABCs, but without singing. And that can be a challenge, right? Sober, right? But they'll ask you to do the ABCs without singing, or ask you to do the ABCs backwards. And that too can be challenging even when you're sober. But as they're giving you instructions to these tests, they're seeing if you can follow directions, right? So as they're telling you how to do the test, are you starting early, right? So, they'll be explaining to you how to do the walk and turn test, and sometimes people will start walking early, right? Or are you starting late, right? They give you all the instructions, they tell you to start, and instead of move, you're just standing there, right? If they tell you to keep your hands at your side, are you extending them because, you can't keep your balance, right? Do you continue, if you're doing the counting, if they tell you to start from 100 and go down to 53, are you going to 47 or 32? Did you take 10 steps instead of the 8 that they asked you to do? Or if they asked you to do 10, did you do 13? Losing your balance, all these different type of things. So they are checking off on their paper, there's a bunch of things that they can check off to see if you are showing signs of impairment. And if you are, then eventually they'll probably ask you to take a breathalyzer test. And this is a way that they can measure your blood alcohol concentration in the field. And the big thing that a lot of people aren't aware of is you are not obligated to take this test. You are legally allowed to refuse the breathalyzer test in the field. Right. Now, understand that if you do get arrested for a DUI and they ask you to take a chemical test at the station, and that can be a breath test or a blood test, you cannot refuse that test. If you refuse that test, there's going to be some serious consequences for you. So you have to pick one, breath or blood. We always advise people to take blood. The reason being is, number one, the officer has to be a bit more precise and accurate in his reports if you opt for blood. The reason being is they don't get the results right there on the spot. So if the officer is saying that, oh, well, he was slurring his speech and he was stumbling all over himself and exaggerating in his reports, and then the blood comes back that you were at, 0.06 or 0.07, it's going to be pretty clear that he was exaggerating or stretching the truth in his report. The other thing is we can have blood independently tested. So if there's reason to believe that the results that came back from the lab are false or inaccurate, then you can have your blood independently tested by an independent lab. But with breath, like once you take that test and it spits out the reading, then that's it. You can't save the breath, right? So we always advise people to do a breath test. And the other thing is, if you refuse, then they can get a warrant. They'll call in to a judge who's working, pulling an all-nighter, and they'll say, hey, we need a warrant to take a forced blood draw, and they'll strap you down and they'll forcibly draw your blood. So if they're going to get your blood anyway, you might as well avoid the consequences of refusing to take the test and allow them to do so. So anyway, back to the breathalyzer test in the field. You're not obligated to take that test, but understand, if you refuse to take the test and the officer believes you're under the influence, then they'll probably arrest you, even if you didn't take the test and they don't have that number, right? But it can help your case if they don't have the BAC from the breathalyzer, especially if that readout was going to be at a 0.08 or more. And so if you refuse the test and the officer believes that you are driving under the influence of alcohol, they're probably going to arrest you even without those results. But again, it can help your case if they don't have that BAC reading from the breathalyzer. Now, if you do take the test and you're at or above a 0.08, then they're going to arrest you for DUI. And Justin refused the test and he ended up getting arrested. He was held overnight. He had his arraignment the next day. He was only charged with the driving while intoxicated charge. And listen, at the end of the day, we don't know how this is going to play out, but really, I mean, this isn't the crime of the century, right? Even if he gets convicted, he's not going to have to do any jail time. He'll just have to pay a fine. He'll probably have to take some DUI classes and he'll be on probation. So again, in my opinion, it's not something he deserves crazy judgment over. It shouldn't tarnish his legacy or anything like that. It's just a bad move to be driving under the influence of alcohol, if in fact he was. It very well could come back that, through the lab results and doing the analysis, because it's not necessarily black and white that somebody was driving under the influence of alcohol. Even if the results come back that he was at above a 0.08, the thing you have to understand is, there's never a nurse jabbing a needle in your arm while you're, driving behind the wheel, right? So just because you might have been at a 0.08 at the time you took the test doesn't necessarily mean that you were at or above a 0.08 at the time you were driving. And that's what really counts. So, DUIs are very scientific like that. They have to do something called retrograde extrapolation in order to make a determination as to what his BAC probably was at the time of driving. Well, that's it for this story. Until there's new developments, if you got something out of it, please show me some love, hit the like button, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on those notifications so you never miss a new video when it drops. As always, I want to thank you so much for watching, and until next time, peace.